Tonight, our program is presented by Joyce Haworth, who has a master's degree in history from the University of Chicago. For over 20 years, she has been developing and presenting history lectures for adults all over the Chicago area. Through her talks, Joyce hopes to bring history to life and foster a deeper understanding and appreciation of our nation's story. So please welcome Joyce Haworth.
Well, thank you, everyone. Let me ask, first of all, how is my sound? Especially for you folks in the back, I'm coming in loud and clear. Okay, should that change, then just wave your hands. I will eventually notice you because I do want to make sure that the technology is working for us. Well, I'm so glad that you're here. Happy 4th of July, a couple weeks in advance. I think we're still a couple weeks out, aren't we? Holy cow. I guess June has just whipped by. How about that? Well, I'm glad you're here to consider the times and the trials of the signers of the Declaration of Independence and the risks that they took. And this is a 90-minute program, but there will be time at the end for questions and comments. I'm very curious to hear what you're thinking about, what kinds of thoughts this generates for you. And if you have any questions at the end, of course, I will also endeavor to answer them as well. I hope you are intrigued by this painting. It is unusual in that it portrays a night battle. This is of the Paoli Massacre, which was a military event during the Revolutionary War, September 1777. It took place near Philadelphia. And unfortunately, the massacre part was on the American side. The British launched a surprise attack on the Americans. The British used sabers and bayonets, and the Americans responded with musket fire. Well, when you shoot a musket, it flashes, and that revealed the Americans' positions in the dark, and didn't go so well for the Americans that day. This painting does a good job, I think, of illustrating the chaos of a night attack. It was commissioned by someone who was there, Lieutenant Richard St. George. St. George was an Irishman fighting on the American side. For years, it hung in his house in Ireland as a remembrance of his experiences in the American Revolution. And now it is housed in the Museum of the American Revolution in Philadelphia. So there's a Revolutionary War story for you. Tonight will be all stories, the stories of those who signed our most famous document. Well, before you sat down and looked at the handout, how many of the signers of the Declaration do you think you could name? Out of 56? Yeah, 3, right? 3, 5. Yeah, it's surprising. You know, sometimes it's in a group like this, I bet we would get some of the lesser known ones. Some people have a family connection or you just know something about that individual. But I think people flounder a little bit, you know, after Jefferson, Adams, Franklin, who all was there. Stephen Hopkins, Caesar Rodney, Button Gwinnett, Lyman Hall. It's curious, this image of signing the Declaration is so familiar to us, but those who signed it, not so much. So today I want to share with you some of the stories of the 56 men who signed it and how they served the independence movement, and also how many of them sacrificed for it. Some paid a high cost indeed for independence. All right, well, what kind of men were they, first of all? First of all, they're all men, alrighty? There were no women signers, of course. Of course, this is the 18th century. There was no question that they would all be male. And they were all white. They were all of British descent. Again, of course, that was how power flowed in this time and place. Most of them were professional men. The most popular profession among them was law. 23 of the 56 were lawyers, though for some of them, the law was not their principal vocation. So for instance, Thomas Jefferson had trained as a lawyer, but he didn't practice law for very long. He was mainly a plantation owner and manager. Commerce was the second most popular. 17 of the 56 were merchants. Plantation owner was third. Plantation owner of a large commercial farm that employed enslaved labor. Most of those plantations were in the South, of course, but not all of them. Slavery was legal and practiced in all 13 colonies. And in New York colony, there were some very large farms that were manned with slave labor that probably qualified as a plantation. Then among the rest of them, there was a handful of other professions. There were a few doctors, there was a minister, and a handful of other professions as well. Many of the signers had been to college in an era when very few people went to college. So this is the upper crust, in other words. These are the leaders in business and in society. And they were also the political leaders. They were the leaders of their colonies and later on of the very young United States. They were in fact all members of the Second Continental Congress, which was the body that was running the war in 1776. As I prepared this talk, the thing that stood out to me the most was that about the signers of the Declaration was that signing the Declaration for most of them was only one thing that they did in the cause of American freedom. Many of them had been serving the cause for American rights in their home states, in their home colonies rather, for years before this. Their names show up in the Stamp Act Congress of 1765 and on the committees of correspondence in the 1770s and on the rolls of the Sons of Liberty in their various colonies. A good number served on the battlefield, and many of them continued to serve their nation after the war. 16 of these 56 signed the Articles of Confederation. 6 of them signed the Constitution. And many of them went on to serve in Congress, and especially they went on to serve in their own states as governors, as judges, as local political men. Well, who was there? Well, the most famous man there was Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin from Pennsylvania, but already world famous for his lightning rod. He was one of the very few Americans who was known outside of the colonies. Curiously, Franklin had been suspected by Americans of being a spy for Great Britain only the year before this. Franklin, you see, had spent most of the previous 20 years living in London. He had come home only in 1775, and he had loved London. Now, he was there on the business of American interests. He was an agent for Pennsylvania colony and for other colonial interests in general. He was a booster for the American colonies, in other words, but he was very much at home in Great Britain. And he hobnobbed with some of the most powerful of the British aristocrats. Look at how he's dressed in this portrait with the powdered wig, and that's a very, very nice coat there. He was probably planning on retiring in Great Britain. Maybe he never would have come home if things had not gone differently for him. But things did go differently. Things fell apart for him. He fell out of favor. An incident happened where Franklin was publicly humiliated. He was dressed down in front of the Privy Council by some of those very aristocrats whom he had counted as his friends and his supporters. And he was deeply affronted, and so he came home. Somewhere along the line, he embraced the patriot cause. And once he did that, he never looked back. But at first, Americans were not sure where his true loyalties were, because boy, he would be if he was secretly a supporter of Great Britain, he would be the perfect spy, wouldn't he? But in time, he proved his loyalty to them. And so now, Benjamin Franklin, who as a boy had run away from his master in Boston and arrived nearly penniless in Philadelphia, Benjamin Franklin, who was a printer by trade, later on an inventor and philosopher, was now adding another title to his name, that of Founding Father. And in 1776, he was 70 years old, not an age at which becoming a revolutionary necessarily appeals. But in 1776, his service to the revolution was only beginning. Soon he would be off to Paris to try to persuade France to come into the war on America's side. And look at this portrait of him. This was painted in France just a few years after that first one. All American Ben, no wig, very simple broadcloth, I think, coat. In France, he very much put on the persona of the backwoods homespun American. He would wear this bearskin hat that was outrageous. He put on the persona of being, a rustic American. And I think that comes through in this portrait as well. Probably the second most famous man there was John Adams. John Adams was a young lawyer who lived near Boston. He was one of the most forceful writers of the revolutionary generation. He had been publishing essays about politics and political philosophy for 10 years. Ever since war had broken out the year before, Adams had been talking about independence. And he was one of the very few in the Second Continental Congress who was talking about independence. For most of the members of Congress, breaking away from Great Britain was too strong a soup for them. Most of them wanted reconciliation right up through into the spring of 1776. Adams worked hard to change his colleagues' mind. He gave them no rest on the issue, and he spoke so often at the Second Continental Congress that it's almost like a refrain in the records. Mr. Adams rose to speak. Mr. Adams rose to speak. The third most famous man there, well, whoever it probably was not Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson was not quite a nobody in 1776. He was known, but he was not well known. He was not yet the sage of Monticello. All of that was ahead of him. And in 1776, he was one of the youngest men in Congress. He was, I believe, 32 years old in 1776. I wanted to start with Franklin, Adams, and Jefferson because they were on the committee to compose a Declaration of Independence, they and two others. And it's a little surprising that Jefferson got the plum job of actually writing the Declaration because he was the junior member, right? He was about the youngest on the committee. Now, he was already known to be a fine writer. He had done some political writing already, but there were two other excellent writers on that committee, right? There was Franklin and there was Adams. So how did the young guy get the plum job? Well, Franklin was ill that spring and summer. He was on the committee, but he was not active on the committee. And so Thomas Jefferson said to John Adams, "You do the writing." And Adams said, "No, it should be you." Adams said, "It should not be me. I'm from Massachusetts. All the trouble has been in Massachusetts. So if a Massachusetts man writes the Declaration, it will convey the message that this is just a New England conflict. Where you are from Virginia, the oldest, largest, most prominent of the colonies, and I think the coolest of the colonies too." And then Adams added, "Plus you can write 10 times better than I can." But think about this. The Declaration of Independence might have been written by Benjamin Franklin if things had gone a little differently. Or it might have been written by John Adams. And it still would have been magnificent, but it would have been a much different document. For those things that we associate with the Declaration, the graceful language, the lovely summation of Lockean philosophy, that was pure Jefferson. The committee to write the Declaration of Independence was formed on June 11th of 1776, even though a good number of the state delegations were not yet ready to vote for independence. I want to talk about this process for a little bit about the two votes that took place on July 1st and on July 2nd. By July 1776, the conflict between Great Britain and the colonies had been going on for about 10 years, and open warfare had been going on for over a year. In those 10 years, there was conflict over taxes and representation, and the role that Great Britain was going to play in the affairs of the colonies. There had been protests and riots and bloodshed. And there have been many political essays written as well about the issue in the American press, in the dozens of little newspapers up and down the eastern seaboard. So 10 years of that. And then in 1775, there was actual military engagement. A volunteer militia arrayed to protest Great Britain's actions. Somebody fired and both sides fired back. That resulted in the battles of Lexington and Concord. That was April 1775. And it was right around that time that the Second Continental Congress convened. The colonies had agreed the year before to have this gathering of colonial representatives to touch base on how things were going with the conflict, to touch base on how their demands for autonomy were coming along. They had agreed in the fall to meet in the spring of 1775. And when they did, there was a war on. And it fell to the Second Continental Congress to manage this war, to commission officers, to somehow figure out how to pay for it. And now it was over a year later, and Americans had to decide, what is the fight all about? Is this a fight for the American colonies' rightful place within the British Empire? For some kind of autonomy within the British Empire? Or was this an independence movement? In early 1776, the majority of Americans swung in their opinions from desiring reconciliation with Britain to desiring independence. At the beginning of the year, most people said, no, independence is a terrible idea. Plus, in a fight with Great Britain, we would lose. They said, we need to stay within the British Empire, the strongest, most advanced political union of its day. But by the summer, because of a remarkable series of events, there was a remarkable change of opinion and a change within the Continental Congress as well, a swing toward independence. So now it's summer of 1776. It's time for Congress to vote on whether or not this war is going to be about independence or reconciliation. I think you probably had a good look at this slide showing the members of Congress grouped by state. By the way, Rhode Island isn't pointed out. Stephen Hopkins and William Ellery over there on the right, that's Rhode Island, and New Hampshire is broken up a little bit. They are at the top of that column and the bottom. But this is important because in the Second Continental Congress, members voted by colony. You'll notice that different colonies had different numbers in their delegation. Each colony decided how many members they were going to send. But however many members there were in the delegation, one colony, one vote. That's how it went. So a unanimous vote in Congress would be 13-0, right? And also, before they could vote for independence, their colonial government back home had to give them permission. Some delegations at the Congress did not have permission from their home colony to vote for independence as of June 1776. So New York, for instance, some delegations did have permission, but the delegates themselves opposed independence. South Carolina, for instance, the colony had said, you can go ahead if you think it's a good idea, but the actual delegates were not on board. And then some delegations were divided. Delaware was divided. But a vote on this monumental decision was soon at hand, and so Congress commissioned a Declaration of Independence to have composed and ready to go in case the vote went in favor of independence. That was in June 11th. A lot happened in the next few weeks. Some colonies that had been on the fence came around. Colonies that had opposed independence came around to support it. For a couple of colonies that involved a coup within the colonial government. So for instance, in Pennsylvania, the colonial government was thrown out and a new set of leaders came to power. They authorized the delegates to declare independence. Something similar happened in New Jersey. In New Jersey, the governor there opposed independence. He was declared by the colonial assembly to be, quote, an enemy to the liberties of this country, and he was arrested. By the way, the governor of New Jersey was William Franklin, the son of Benjamin Franklin. Well, once the governor was out of the way, the colony gave the New Jersey delegation the thumbs up to vote for independence. Only the New York delegates were unable to get revised instruction due to a little problem. New York was being invaded by the British at that time. They were busy, and it was a little hard to get messages through to Philadelphia as well. On July 1st, Congress had its first vote for independence, and Mr. Adams rose to speak, and he made the speech of his life to persuade the wavering. But still, only 9 colonies voted in favor. Two colonies are still against, Pennsylvania and South Carolina. Delaware was divided, and New York abstained, no permission from home yet. That night, some wheeling and dealing must have gone on. The wavering must have been worked on by the convinced. The next day, South Carolina came on board to support independence. For Pennsylvania, 2 delegates found that they still could not, in good conscience, vote for independence, but they agreed to step outside during the vote so that they would not thwart the will of the majority. That was Robert Morris and John Dickinson, by the way. Robert Morris would eventually come around. He would sign the Declaration of Independence. John Dickinson never did. Then Delaware came on board through a great story that I will tell in a little bit. And New York, again, abstained. They would not get permission from their home colony to vote yes until the following week. Nevertheless, the vote went down and it was 12-0. 12 colonies in favor, none opposed, 1 colony abstaining. So when we read in the Declaration, and you see it there, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America, what that means is unanimous as in none opposed. Right? But 1 colony did abstain. The unanimous vote was 12-0, not 13-0. So that's there's a fun fact for you. With that vote on July 2nd, all political ties with Great Britain were formally abolished. And you might be thinking, hang on a minute, July 2nd, why do we celebrate July 4th then? And if you ask that, you're in very good company, because that very day, John Adams wrote an excited letter home, and he said, July 2nd will forever in the future be a great American holiday. The reason is the document itself was dated July 4th, and it was signed by the President of the Continental Congress on July 4th, so we have 4th of July and not the 2nd of July. And by the way, only the President of the Continental Congress, that was John Hancock, only he signed on July 4th. The image of the signing ceremony that we're so familiar with, actually that ceremony happened a month later, August 2nd. Why the delay? Well, they had to have the Declaration engrossed, as they say, had put in beautiful fancy writing and prepared and yeah. Okay, well, let's talk about John Hancock and his big signature. Who has heard the story about John Hancock's signature and King George III? Who's heard that story? I heard this story as a kid, that Hancock signed his name so big so that King George could read it without putting on his glasses. So the idea was the king and Hancock were old buddies, and Hancock wanted to stick it in the king's face. Ha ha, I'm part of the rebel movement. So even as the king was squinting, trying to make out this blurry document because he didn't have his glasses, one name would stand out and he could gnash his teeth extra hard, right? But alas, that is not true. The king and John Hancock were not acquaintances. Well, why was his signature so big? Well, because he signed first. He was president of the Congress. He signed first, and he had a big signature. And frankly, he had all that white space, right? It's kind of like the group birthday card effect, where the first 4 people take up all the room and everyone else is like squeezing their good wishes in on the side. It was something like that. Well, who was this guy? John Hancock was a Bostonian. He was one of the wealthiest men in the colonies. He had been orphaned as a child and raised by an uncle and an aunt. In time, he took over his uncle's import-export business called the House of Hancock, and he became an exceedingly wealthy man. His home was a fancy house in the fanciest part of town, up on Beacon Hill. The House of Hancock, his business, had been hit rather hard by the turmoil between the colonies and Great Britain. There had been economic turmoil. There had been boycotts before the war. If you're in import-export, that's not good for business. And the British were now seizing American ship cargoes. That's bad for business too. War is not a good climate for those in merchandising and shipping. For this reason, it was more likely that people like John Hancock would be loyalists to Britain and not revolutionaries. And so one of the surprising things about our revolution was how many upper-class people, how many upper-class men, successful men, middle-aged men chose the revolutionary side. Men like Hancock and Franklin and the Lees, the Lee family and the Livingston family in New York and others. John Hancock was also no latecomer to this struggle. He had been in the fight for American rights for years before this. He hobnobbed with Sam Adams, who was a working class guy. He worked with him to organize protests in Boston against the British. And now this prominent man, this longtime patriot, was signing the Declaration of Independence. Well, I said there were 5 on the committee to write the Declaration. I've talked about Adams and Jefferson and Franklin. There was also Roger Sherman and Robert Livingston. And these 2 are interesting because they reflect 2 different kinds of people who were there, 2 different kinds of men who were there. Those who began in humble circumstances and rose, and those who were already born to wealth. So Roger Sherman of Connecticut, a shoemaker by trade, but not just a shoemaker, truly a self-made man. He was a lover of books and a lover of learning. In the course of his life, Sherman ran a store. He served as a surveyor. He published an almanac, which means he did all of the astronomical calculations for the almanac. So an almanac will list the sunrises and sunsets for the year coming. If you're writing an almanac, you have to make those calculations. So he did that. Then he became a lawyer, and then a judge, and in time, the mayor of New Haven, Connecticut. Roger Sherman was the only person to sign 4 key documents of our founding. He signed the Continental Association, which established the first Continental Congress. That was 1774. He signed the Declaration. He signed the Articles of Confederation, which was Constitution 1.0. And then he signed our current Constitution. Sherman was an awkward, unlovely man. This portrait is not done with much skill. It was done by an American painter, and most American portrait painters were frankly not very good. They just didn't have the training that European painters had. But I think the stark style of this portrait is fitting for a stark man like Sherman. John Adams described him as rigid as starched linen and awkward as a junior bachelor. And yet, Roger Sherman was a powerful orator in an age that greatly valued oration. The final member of the Committee of 5 was Robert Livingston, a landowner from New York, one of 2 of the influential Livingston clan that was at the convention. Philip Livingston was also there. And what's most notable about Robert Livingston was he never got to sign the Declaration. Okay, he was on the committee to write the thing. He voted in favor of independence on July 2nd, but the signing ceremony was not for another month, and by that time, he was back home. He had been recalled by New York. So we don't actually count Robert Livingston as one of the 56 signers, even though he was on the committee to write the thing, which shows how slender the line was between becoming a signer with a capital S, right, and not. There was a lot of coming and going in the Second Continental Congress. Some of those who signed for independence, some of those who voted for independence never signed. Some of those who signed in August had joined Congress after July 2nd, so they had never voted for independence. One fellow actually joined the Continental Congress on August 2nd. So he goes down in history as a signer because if he had had a headache that day and shown up the next day, August 3rd, he would not have had that to his name. Oh, fickle fortune. That's all we can say about that. But Robert Livingston did have his day in the sun. When the time came for George Washington to take his oath of office as the first president, there was a bit of casting about to figure out who should administer the oath of office. It's supposed to be the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, but there wasn't a Supreme Court yet when Washington was taking his oath. So they went to the highest ranking judge in New York. At that time, the nation's capital was in New York City. That judge was Robert Livingston. So even though he missed being a signer, he did get to administer the first presidential oath of office. So this is the fun fact about the Declaration of Independence. Not everybody who voted got to sign. Not everyone who signed voted for independence, though they were in favor of independence. It is thought that about 50 were present in Congress in early July. We don't actually know the number of, or the names of who was actually present. Of those, though, we do know that eight who were present for the vote never signed. 3 of those 8 were in favor of independence, but they left Congress before the signing ceremony in August, and they never got their opportunity to sign. That was George Clinton, Robert Livingston, as I mentioned, and Henry Wisner. They were all from New York. 5 of the 8 were opposed to independence. 4 of the 5 were replaced by their colonies before the vote on July 2nd, or rather between the vote on July 2nd and the signing ceremony on August 2nd, I should say replaced by their states actually, and their replacements signed. And then one fellow stayed in Congress the whole time, vigorously protested the independence movement from start to finish. That was John Dickinson of Pennsylvania. Then there were a handful of delegates who were not there in July, who were there in August. They signed even though they hadn't voted for independence. Their numbers include 2 men that I will be discussing, Benjamin Rush and Charles Carroll. And then finally, there was Thomas McCain of Delaware, who voted in July, who missed the signing ceremony in August, but finally did sign in 1781. The mention of Thomas McCain brings me to the story of his colony, the colony of Delaware. The story of how Delaware ended up in the yes column is one of the most dramatic. Delaware had 3 delegates, Thomas McCain, Caesar Rodney, and George Reed, and they were divided on the independence movement. The colony of Delaware itself was divided in its opinion, and the delegation was also divided. Caesar Rodney and Thomas McCain were in favor of independence. George Reed said, it's not time yet. It's just not time yet. On that first vote for independence on July 1st, only Reed and McCain were present. Caesar Rodney was home in Delaware. He was working his other job, which was Brigadier General of the Delaware Militia. He was home dealing with loyalists who were making things hot for the Patriots in Delaware. And so in that first vote, Delaware was divided, and so they cast no vote. Well, everybody knew a second vote was coming the next day. Thomas McCain had already sent a message home to Caesar Rodney, you have to get back to Philadelphia to vote. That message arrived at his home on the night of July 1st, and Rodney reacted. He saddled up, he left immediately. And they say he rode 80 miles in one night through a thunderstorm, no less, a journey that would normally take 2 days. And he was not a well man. His health was fragile. He had had a bout of cancer that had left him weakened, and it also had disfigured his face. Caesar Rodney wore a kind of veil across his face to hide the disfigurement. So an arduous ride was not good for someone in his state of health. Nevertheless, he did it. And furthermore, they say he arrived in the nick of time, that the vote had already begun when he walked in. Perhaps he even strode into the chamber, dripping wet, still in his spurs, saying, Delaware for independence, Delaware for independence. We don't really know. We don't really know all that. We just know that Delaware was in the yes column. We don't even know if he made the journey by horseback. There is an alternate legend of him taking a carriage, which makes a heck of a lot more sense to me than post-riding 80 miles, in my opinion. But the state of Delaware has already decided the matter for itself. There is the Delaware corridor. There's Caesar Rodney galloping along. And who are we to gainsay the state of Delaware? You'll notice that they also have on there the first state because they signed onto the Constitution first. If you feel that that means they're the first state, then perhaps you're from Delaware. So go Delaware. All right. Well, who else was there? Well, William Whipple of New Hampshire was there. Another poor boy who made good. He had been a country boy. He ran away to sea. He became a ship's captain at the age of 21. He made a fortune in the slave trade. He retired at the age of 45. But he kept his ties to his slaving days in that he kept a slave as a body servant, a man named Prince. When Whipple went to war as a brigadier general in the New Hampshire militia, he brought Prince with him to care for his needs, which is pretty common among slaveholding officers. Whipple finally freed Prince a year before Whipple died. Both men are buried in the same graveyard, and both have headstones indicating that they are Revolutionary War veterans. So William Whipple, the self-made man. Another self-made man who was there was George Taylor of Pennsylvania. George Taylor was born in Ireland, and he had come to America as an indentured servant. He was indentured to a man who owned an iron works, and after his master died, Taylor ended up marrying the widow, dear me, and taking over the ironworks business and doing very well in it. Thank you very much. So we can contrast those two with Charles Carroll of Carrollton. Charles Carroll of Carrollton. That was how he signed his name. You see his name there about at the bottom underneath John Hancock. Charles Carroll of Carrollton. He added that too because there were so many Charles Carrolls running around Maryland that it was hard to tell them apart. So he added the name of his plantation to distinguish himself. Carroll was the only Catholic signer. And they say that when Carroll signed the Declaration, he said, well, there go a few millions. I don't know if that story is true. Even if it's not true, surely that was on the mind of many of the wealthy men, because either way, they were going to be out quite a bit of dough because of independence. If the United States lost the war, they probably would lose their property, an amount of their property. But even if they won, it would be very expensive. And the wealthy of the nation were going to be strongly encouraged to help pick up part of the tab. So Whipple, Taylor, and Carroll, two self-made men and a man born wealthy. Is my microphone still good? Because I just jogged it a little bit. Okay. Well, here's another pairing. Urban agitator on the streets of Boston versus political organizer in Plantation, Virginia. That would be Samuel Adams of Massachusetts and Richard Henry Lee of Virginia. Samuel Adams, John Adams' second cousin, for years the more popular, the better known Adams. We know him maybe best for his brand of beer. Actually, is Sam Adams' beer still around? Okay, all right, it is. I'm not a beer drinker. He was in fact a maltster. He was not a brewer. He made the malt for the beer, but he was much more than that. He was a graduate of Harvard College. He was eventually governor of Massachusetts. But his real gift, Sam Adams' real gift, lay in political organization, in forming political opinion, in developing a narrative of events that people could understand and that motivated them, and also in helping elections to go in a certain direction. This is also true. And his talents also lay in his ability to muster a mob for demonstrating, or a mob for out-and-out rioting, or a mob to dress up as Native Americans and dump tea in the harbor, for instance. Adams had been agitating for American rights for 10 years before signing the Declaration. He was one of the very first who spoke out against taxation without representation, who described it as a violation of British rights. After the great effort that he had put forward all of those years, it must have been sweet for him to sign the Declaration. Contrast him with Richard Henry Lee of Virginia. Of course, we have a Lee from Virginia involved, the most prominent family in Virginia. And he was not the only Lee there. There were two Lees who signed the Declaration. Francis Lightfoot Lee also signed. Richard Henry Lee was to the manor born. He had a very different background than Samuel Adams. But he too had been a leader in the agitation against Great Britain for the decade before he put his signature to the Declaration, like Sam Adams. He had helped organize the Virginia Sons of Liberty during the Stamp Act crisis. He helped enforce boycotts of goods during the Townsend duties. And he proposed the resolution for independence on July 1st. He was the individual who rose on July 1st and formally proposed that, and that was most appropriate. That was most appropriate to have a member of the most prominent family of the oldest colony make this proposal. In the war, Richard Henry Lee fought with the Virginia militia. Later on, he was a senator under the Constitution. And then their cousin, Light Horse Harry Lee, that was Henry Lee III, served under George Washington. This third Lee would have a son rather late in life, whom he named Robert Edward Lee, and Robert E. Lee, of course, would serve in another war much later. Isn't that amazing that, 1860 is a long way from 1776, that Robert E. Lee's father would have served in the Revolutionary War. All right, well, Benjamin Rush was also there. Who has heard of Benjamin Rush? All right, a few people have heard of Benjamin Rush. Who has been to the Rush University System for Health? Rush has nothing to do with how soon the doctor will see you. It has everything to do with Benjamin Rush, the most prominent physician in colonial America. Rush was another one of those who'd been in the conflict years before 1776. He'd written a number of political pamphlets. It was he who was a patron to Thomas Paine. It was he who, in 1775, he encouraged Thomas Paine to write Common Sense and to help him get that incredibly influential pamphlet published. After Rush's stint in the Second Continental Congress, he was the Surgeon General of the Army. But then he got into trouble. He criticized General Washington. He called Washington's army, quote, an unformed mob. And he said sanitation in Washington's army was terrible, and it probably was, to be honest. Rush thought that another American general, General Horatio Gates, ran a much better army, and he thought Gates should replace Washington. And he said so in a letter, and that letter found its way into the hands of General Washington. Washington had Rush removed as the Army's Surgeon General. But Rush remained a patriot, of course. In after years, he was a delegate to the Constitutional Convention, and he served as the treasurer of the U.S. Mint for 15 years. Then there was his influential career in medicine. Benjamin Rush wrote the first American textbook in chemistry. He pioneered in areas of mental health and addiction. He was also important in the Lewis and Clark expedition. So this is several decades after these events I'm talking about tonight. But before he and Clark headed west, Meriwether Lewis got a crash course in medicine from Dr. Rush. And Rush also gave him a bunch of his own homemade medicines to take with him. And that has turned out that those medicines that Rush developed, that he sent off with Lewis and Clark, has turned out to be very helpful in our time, because Rush's medicines have enabled us to track the Lewis and Clark expedition across the continent. One of his homemade medicines, you see, had a lot of mercury in it. This was a medicine to take care of constipation on the expedition across the continent. I know this is an unlovely topic, but truly this was a big problem for the Lewis and Clark expedition. They were on an all-meat diet, no roughage. So they had a lot of constipation, but Rush's medicine sorted the men out very, very quickly. All that mercury took care of it, so much that the men called those pills thunderclappers. And I'm sure we all wince thinking of them in just ingesting all that mercury, which of course is poisonous. And yet these days we can be grateful because of this, we can trace their exact root. Mercury, you see, is a heavy metal, and heavy metals pretty much stay put where they are put. So the Lewis and Clark expedition, they went across the continent ingesting mercury. The mercury left their bodies in the usual way. And so they left, basically the expedition left a trail of mercury west across the continent that is still discernible in the 21st century. And I'm not going to make the scatological joke that occurs. I'm going to keep it classy. And I'm going to say, thus we do know their exact root. How about that? Thank you, Benjamin Rush. All right, well, just as the nation's most prominent, one of the nation's most prominent doctor was there, so also was one of the nation's most prominent lawyers, and that was George Wythe. George Wythe was a classical scholar and a professor of law at the College of William and Mary. His true calling, though, was in mentoring the upper class of Virginia. Wythe accepted law students as boarders in his home, and he tutored them. But he tutored them not just in the law, he also tutored them in how to be a man of power while also being a decent human being, while remaining a decent human being. Or in other words, how to be a gentleman. That's how they would put it in that era. And he taught them this through his example and through conversation at his table and in studies. Wythe tutored many of Virginia's finest, including John Marshall and Henry Clay, and Thomas Jefferson as well. Jefferson never boarded with him, but often dined with him. And in later years, Jefferson said of George Wythe, "He was my ancient master, my earliest and best friend, and to him I am indebted for first impressions which have had the most salutary influence on the course of my life." It was George Wythe who designed the seal of Virginia, which is an image of virtue cutting down tyranny with a sword, and the motto, Sic Semper Tyrannis, which is Latin for thus ever to tyrants. Wythe was only one of two signers who died violently. Neither one of those signers was killed on the battlefield. George Wythe was murdered by his nephew. Here's what happened. The nephew had expected to be his heir, but then he discovered that Uncle George had willed a lot of the family property to his old housekeeper. And he willed another good chunk to a young man whom Wythe was tutoring. And both of those two were African American, by the way. So the nephew said, "I know how I'm going to solve this. I will poison all three." And he did. The young man died. George Wythe survived long enough to help the investigation and to swear out a new will to cut out the nephew. The housekeeper survived, but the nephew was never convicted, in part because the testimony of the housekeeper was not accepted because she was African American. Lyman Hall of Georgia. It must have been sweet for Lyman Hall to sign this document. For a long time, he was just about the only one in Georgia who was interested in the protest movement in Great Britain. Georgia was the newest of the 13 colonies. It was founded only in 1732, and it was the weakest. And it was right next to the Spanish possession of Florida, so it relied on British naval protection for its survival. So when people further north were talking about organizing and protesting against Great Britain in the 1770s, for a long time, Georgia was not interested. Enter Lyman Hall. He was not a native Georgian. He was a Yankee from Connecticut. He lived in the one county in Georgia that was full of Yankees. And he tried to get Georgia interested in the protest movement. So back in 1774, for instance, he tried to get Georgia interested in the First Continental Congress. Georgia said, "Forget it." Then in March of 1775, when the conflict was heating up even more between Crown and colonies, Hall's county took action. They voted to send a delegate to the Second Continental Congress. They had no authority from Georgia to do that. Their county was doing this. And guess who they appointed? Lyman Hall. He was going to be the rogue delegate. One guy. He showed up in Philadelphia. The Second Continental Congress tactfully allowed him to attend, but not to vote, because he was not there with the authority of his colony. But in 1776, Georgia came around, and two more delegates were appointed. And this is all to the credit of Lyman Hall. And then there was Robert Morris of Pennsylvania, the financer of the Revolution. Morris was a wealthy man, and he knew a lot about money as well. This picture here is a section of the mural painted on the inside of the rotunda in the Capitol building in Washington. You can see there is Robert Morris in a dark coat with a pen in his hand, a quill in his hand. He is receiving a helpful sack of gold from the god Mercury. Morris was one of those Pennsylvania delegates who chose to skip the vote on July 2nd. He was not fully persuaded that the independence was the right move. But when the time came to sign a month later, he was sufficiently persuaded, and he signed. And after that, he was clearly on board. And we know this because he put his fortune and his financial smarts to the service of the United States. He put his money where his mouth was. They say if you want to know what a person truly believes, see how they spend their money. The help that Morris could give was much needed. Congress was always short of money with which to buy supplies from the army. The states were very slow to finance the army's needs. Morris did the best he could to find money. He borrowed money. He borrowed money on his credit. He didn't borrow on the United States credit because his credit was so much better than the United States credit. Ironically, Morris ended up in debtor's prison toward the end of his life. He got involved in land speculation after the war. Land speculation is where you buy up cheap Western land before the settlers get there, right? And then you hang on to it. And when the settlers get there, you sell the land to them for a handsome profit. At one time or other, he owned most of Western New York, plus millions of acres in 4 other states. But the settlers who were supposed to show up did not come fast enough, and he lost money. And then he lost more money when he invested heavily in Washington City, the new national capital, which was being built from the ground up, but didn't have a lot of interest. People really weren't interested in investing in this muddy, mosquito-ridden city. So he lost money in his investments there as well. So the financer of the revolution sat in debtor's prison for over 3 years. Isn't that incredible? Okay, so far we've had a cobbler made good, a lord of the manor, a physician, a judge, a financer. How about an artist? Francis Hopkinson of Pennsylvania, a businessman, a judge, also an artist. He designed the Great Seal of the United States. And he was also a musician. He learned how to play the harpsichord at the age of 17. He is credited as being one of the first American-born composers. He also invented a couple of new musical instruments. For instance, he invented something called a bellarmonic, which had a keyboard and steel bells. I wish I could show you a picture of it, but I don't think any picture of it survives. It did not catch on. During the Revolution, Hopkinson wrote unflattering songs about the British. Hopkinson may have been the one to design the first American flag. At least he claimed to do so, and no one else has said that it was them. We know he billed Congress for his design work. He charged Congress a quarter cask of the public wine for his design work. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? Public wine. The idea that there would be a government-owned supply of wine and people could be paid in wine for their service to the national government. That's interesting. If it's true that he designed the American flag, and really we have no reason to say it's not true, then it would be his design that Betsy Ross was working off. If it was she who sewed the first flag, and there is circumstantial evidence that she was the one. Then there was Stephen Hopkins, the former governor of Rhode Island colonies. This is Francis Hopkinson. Now we have Stephen Hopkins of Rhode Island, former governor of Rhode Island. He was best known for his fine library, his liquor cabinet, and his excellent hospitality. You were lucky if you got an invitation to Governor Hopkins' boarding house to spend an evening. It was no picnic for the delegates of the Second Continental Congress, running the war. Being a congressman involved long hours, much committee work. Everybody was on several committees. And for most members, at the end of the day, it involved a not very comfortable evening in a rented room, and probably a not very good meal at the end of the day as well. Enter Governor Hopkins. In the evening around 8 o'clock, the invited guests would arrive at his boarding house, and then Hopkins would break out the bottles for those who wanted to imbibe. And he would pull a book off of his shelf and he would read out loud. It might be Pope or Milton, or maybe history, British history, or Greek or Roman history. And he would read aloud to the company. John Adams said, Hopkins never drank to excess, but all he drank was immediately not only converted into wit, sense, knowledge, and good humor, but inspired us all with similar qualities. Adams said, the flow of his soul made all of his reading his own and seemed to bring to recollection in all of us all we had ever read. They would stay at his place until 11 o'clock or midnight that night, and they would leave feeling elevated and cleansed by the high sentiments and the good company, and they would go to their sleep and prepare for a new day. Adams said, Governor Hopkins of Rhode Island kept us all alive. When it came time to sign the Declaration of Independence, Hopkins gripped the pen and his hand shook with palsy. He actually had to hang on to his right hand with his left to steady his hand. And in that moment, he said, my hand trembles, my heart does not. A lifetime of reading the best authors enabled him to make such an elegant statement at the right moment. You may wonder if being a signer of the Declaration of Independence made you a special target of the British government. There were individuals who were special targets. British commanders had lists of those patriot leaders who would be pardoned in case of a British victory, and there were plenty who were not on the pardon list. Those who are well known would be a special benefit for the British to capture. However, it does not appear that just being a signer of the Declaration of Independence put you on the hit list, that in and of itself. Now, being an agitator in your community, an agitator for independence, that would make you a special target. And having the nicest house in town and being a patriot made your house a special target for the invading troops, but not the fact that being a signer of the Declaration of Independence. And I think that was because eventually the list of signers was published in 1777, but it just wasn't that well known. Now, it turns out that many of the signers were agitators in their communities, and many of them did have the nicest house in town. And so a good number of the signers did suffer loss during the Revolutionary War. None of them died on the battlefield. None were hanged as traitors by the British, but a number did suffer loss, such as Francis Lewis of New York. He had already suffered in a previous war years before. In the French and Indian War, he and a group of others were captured by the French and given over to the Native Americans, presumably to be killed. He managed to get his freedom on that occasion. Years later, soon after he signed the Declaration, he faced the ravages of war once again. His home was destroyed by the British, who were moving through New York at that time. And his wife was captured, and she was held in an unheated cell for some months with no bed and no change of clothing. And she died just a couple of years later. So it is certainly possible that that imprisonment hastened her to her grave. And then to make things worse, Lewis's only daughter ran off and married a British officer. Francis Lewis never remarried after his wife's death. He never rebuilt his home. He lived the final 25 years of his life with his son. And then George Walton of Georgia. Walton served as a colonel in the Georgia militia after his stint in Congress. He was shot in the thigh at the siege of Savannah. He was captured by the British and held for a year as a prisoner of war. Thomas Nelson of Yorktown, Virginia. Yorktown, Virginia, he had the dubious honor of firing on his own home, or at least this is the family legend. During the Battle of Yorktown, he realized that it was his own fine mansion that was being used by British officers as their headquarters. And they say that he coolly told gunners to target his home. And he even offered them 5 guineas for every hit. And if you go and visit his home, you can see the damage on the side there. Other signers suffered loss, but not on the battlefield. Thomas McCain of Delaware was on Great Britain's hit list. In a letter to John Adams in 1777, he wrote, "I have been hunted like a fox by the enemy, compelled to move my family 5 times in a few months, and at last fixed them in a little log house on the banks of the Susquehanna, and then they were soon obliged to move again on account of the incursions of the Indians." William Ellerly of Rhode Island had his house burned by the British during the war. George Clymer of Pennsylvania also had his house destroyed. John Witherspoon. John Witherspoon was the president of the College of New Jersey, someday to become Princeton University. He saw his college ransacked and the library of the college burned. He also lost a son in the war. He was the only signer that we know of who lost a son in the war. Abraham Clark of New Jersey, 2 sons were prisoners of war. Their fate is unclear. John Hart of New Jersey encountered a string of hardships after he signed the Declaration. His wife died that fall of 1776, leaving him responsible for the younger of his 13 children. Most of them, of course, were grown by that time, but still, soon after the British invaded New Jersey, he got the younger kids to safety, and then he himself spent several weeks hiding in the hills near his home, sleeping in caves, sort of an involuntary camping trip, and something that his 60-year-old body did not appreciate, I would imagine. Thomas Jefferson suffered the loss of one of his plantation homes, not Monticello, but another one. When Benedict Arnold invaded Virginia for the second time, he targeted Jefferson's property and burned the plantation to the ground. And George Read of Delaware, I mentioned George Read earlier. This was the Delaware delegate who opposed independence, but he came around and he signed with the rest, and he showed his pluck later on. One night he was crossing the Delaware River in a little boat, and he got stuck on a sandbar or something in the middle of the river in sight of a British ship. And I can imagine he's thinking, uh-oh, and sure enough, the British came to see what was going on. I imagine he was thinking, oh boy, if they find out who I am, I'm going to be in big trouble. But he kept his head and he spun them a story. Oh, I'm just a simple country parson trying to get home with my family. And the British believed him, and they even helped him get across the river. Nice guys. Other founders lost money that they had loaned to the war effort. Benjamin Franklin, for instance, loaned $3,000 to the government, which he never saw again. John Hancock lent money to the United States that took wings. He never saw that again. Carter Braxton of Virginia loaned 25,000 pounds to the cause that was never repaid. Braxton also suffered loss from his other investments and property during the war. After the Revolution, he spent some time being hounded by his creditors. Some signers were less noble than the rest, I regret to mention, such as Richard Stockton of New Jersey. Sometime after he signed the Declaration, Stockton found himself a prisoner of war, and his captor said, hey, we'll let you go home if you will sign an oath of loyalty to George III. All you have to do is deny your loyalty to the United States and sign on with Great Britain. And Stockton took the deal. He did it. That was in March of 1777, less than a year after he had signed the Declaration. Now, that December, he re-swore his allegiance to the United States, but I don't think he was ever really forgiven by other patriots who were true to the United States even when they were being imprisoned. And then there was Button Gwinnett of Georgia, who had his throw on the stage of human fame and then exited quickly and with little honor. You may ask why his first name was Button. It's because his godmother's last name was Button, and his parents thought that would be a really good name. Maybe they had a huge family and they're just running out of first names. Button, sure, he looks like his little nose looks like a little button. That works. Well, Button Gwinnett was a young man during the years I've been talking about, and he was a debt-ridden young man, and he could not succeed at anything. He tried to make a go in business, and he failed. He tried to make a go with a plantation, and he failed at that too. He was part of the Georgia delegation. He signed the Declaration with the rest of the Georgians. Then he went home to Georgia, and he got involved in politics. And he got himself into a feud with a political rival. They were both patriots, they were both part of the patriot cause, but they did not like each other. Their feud led to a duel, and in that duel, Button was killed. That was in 1777. And then his grave was lost for many years. Button was lost. He was a lost Button. And then a local historian claimed to have found his grave in Savannah. And so the Smithsonian Institute was called in to verify. And they looked at that and they're like, well, it's certainly an 18th century grave, but it does not look like Button Gwinnett. This really looks like a woman's skeleton. But Savannah said, no, that's Button Gwinnett. And the Smithsonian said, well, we know from the evidence that Button Gwinnett was a tall man. This is kind of a short person, but Savannah would have it no other way. They said, we have Button. And they put up a special monument to him. And the day came for the dedication of Button Gwinnett's new monument. This was in 1964, by the way. And one of the speech makers actually made the joke that perhaps has occurred to you as you have listened to this. He said, we no longer need to ask Button, Button, who has the button? Button has been found. So goes Button Gwinnett. Well, I'm almost at the end of my time. I've left some time here for questions and comments, but I do want to finish by talking about the South Carolinian signers and the anthem that they wrote while they were prisoners of war. This was Thomas Lynch Jr., Arthur Middleton, Edward Rutledge, and Thomas Hayward Jr. All young men, all planters' sons, all of them had been to Oxford University in Britain. We can imagine them riding into Philadelphia to the Second Continental Congress in their finery, wearing finely cut clothing with lace and velvet. We can imagine how they would have stood out next to the dour New England delegates or the middling Pennsylvania businessmen. John Adams described them as, quote, a young, smart, spirited body. 3 of the 4 of them were imprisoned together by the British during the siege of Charleston in early 1780. Thomas Lynch was not. He died in a shipwreck in 1779. But Middleton, Rutledge, and Hayward were all in that battle. Middleton serving in the militia. Rutledge and Hayward were captured, were captains of their militia. All 3 captured, and they are held prisoners of war together for over a year. They spent the nation's 5th birthday in that British prison. So July 4th, 1781, they are in prison. And on that day, Thomas Hayward wrote a song for the occasion, God Save the 13 States. And he set it to the tune of Great Britain's national anthem, God Save the King. And the 3 of them belted it out from their cell, which no doubt their guards really appreciated, hearing their national anthem lampooned in this way. And I thought we could all sing it together. The tune is familiar. It's My Country 'Tis of Thee, right? Ba, 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 ba. So if you like to sing, this is your chance. And if you hate to sing, do it anyway. All right? In honor of the courage and pluck of those South Carolinians and of all 56 of these signers, because they risked their life, their fortune, and their sacred honor for the independence of the United States, the least we can do is sing their song. So even if you hate to sing, let's sing to honor them. Stand up if you can, and if that's comfortable. And what we want to do is we want to make the people in the lobby stop what they're doing and listen. All right, now I do want to make a point. The meter in the second to last song, ba, 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 ba. The word tyrants has several beats, so you want to hit tyrants hard. No tyrants over us. All righty? We want to make George III roll over in his grave. Now, come on, stand up. And you people on Zoom, you are not exempt. We expect you to sing with us. Okay, 1, 2, 3. God save the 13 states, long live the United States. God save our states. Make us victorious, happy and glorious. No tyrants over us. God save our states. Oh, you guys are great. You guys are awesome. You guys are great. Alrighty. By the way, if you're interested in this topic, I wish I had a single book that I could recommend on this topic. I'm not satisfied with a lot of the books that sort of summarize the lives of the signers. So this is 2 that I can recommend. They're both out of print, sorry. But you can get them on Amazon, of course. The Signers of the Declaration, it was put out by the National Park Service some years ago. And then The Lives of the Signers from 1848, still the classic, still the standard. There are others as well besides, but there's a couple of sources anyway. Well, I really appreciate your kind patience. And if you have any questions or comments, I would really love to hear them. Yes.
You made the connection between one of the signers and Robert E. Lee. any other connection between the southern states, particularly their governors and the Civil War?
The question is, yes, the question is that I made the connection between the Lee family and Robert E. Lee in the Civil War. Are there other connections with Civil War figures and the signers of the Declaration? There are plenty of familiar last names between the Revolutionary era and the Civil War era. And my memory at the moment is failing me. But yes, families who were in power. It's only a few generations later, you know, 1 or 2 generations later, the Civil War came around. So yes, there were connections there as well.
Were Sam and John Adams related bloodly?
Were Sam Adams and John Adams related? Yes, they were second cousins. Samuel Adams for a long time was the more prominent Adams. He was older than John. But of course, John Adams is the one we remember since he was president. Yeah. Yes.
Who decided that the country should be named the United States of America?
Wow, what a great question. Yeah, who decided that the country should be named the United States of America? That was a decision of the Second Continental Congress, but I don't remember now the debate around that or how that was chosen. But it was right at the beginning, you know, before the Constitution, even before the Articles of Confederation, which was the first, you know, our first Constitution. And it is interesting, the perception of the United States that each colony was a little country, all right, a state, like a nation state. We're used to thinking of this, we're used to that term states, but the signers understood the political arrangement to be 13 small nation states that were all connected for protection. And at first, that very loose arrangement was instituted. In fact, even the states, or the national government, the first national government did not even have authority to collect taxes. They could ask for money. They could say, we're really broke. We really have, you know, there's a rebellion on, we need to do something about this. Can you help us out? And the states are like, well, we would love to, but, you know, so it had its difficulties. But as far as how that debate happened, I don't know. It's a great question. I should know the answer to that. Thank you. Yes.
I'm just saying there was an article in the New York Times about John Adams and Thomas Jefferson,
Mhm.
and they didn't get along for years, I guess,
Mhm.
after this. And so they have, at Monticello, they have a guide discuss that as if it's the problem today. Back and forth, you know, politics. And I'm sure you know there's more. They both died July 4th, 1826. I find it phenomenal.
Yes.
I mean, they both died on July 4th, the same year, same day.
Yeah. The comment is about John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. This happened with many of the patriots. They ended up on different sides of the political divide in the 1790s.
Yeah, that's right.
We're living in a time of great political turmoil, so we get it. I would say the 1790s, it was even a little bit worse, if you can believe that. Some of the things they accused each other of, we're not quite vile enough yet, but we're getting there. But yeah, so many of the old patriots, and it kind of breaks your heart. You know, they soldiered together in the war. They forged the founding of the nation, but then they disagreed over the course of the nation after that, and they disagreed bitterly. They cared deeply, they disagreed bitterly. And as it turns out, Jefferson and Adams were on different sides. And I will say that Jefferson rather stabbed Adams in the back. And John and Abigail were furious. So that friendship, they had been good friends in Paris, but that friendship died in the 1790s. However, years later, Benjamin Rush got them both together. He's like, come on, that's all over, bury the hatchet. And so they embarked on a long correspondence. They exchanged letters. Neither one of them left their home states. And yes, they both died on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1826. That's remarkable. Adams' last words, they say, one of his last words was, Jefferson survives. But actually, Jefferson had died some hours before, you know, in Virginia. Yeah. Yes,
A question online asking, do you know roughly percentage-wise, like how many white colonists especially were loyalists and how many of them were revolutionary? Like the breakdown of the general populace.
Yeah, so the question is how many, percentage-wise, how many of the white colonists were loyalists and how many were revolutionaries? It's really hard to know. It's really hard to know that. The going number is about 20% of the population were loyalist. There were some areas that were very loyalist. For instance, New York City was very loyalist. Certain regions were more conservative, more loyalist. Yeah, 20%, and then, you know, perhaps another 40% were red hot revolutionaries. And then I suppose there's some in the middle, but you know, when you go through a war, when war passes over your country, that tends to polarize a nation. So certainly the majority of the American population was committed to the war effort and to independence by the end of it. But there was an exodus of Americans to Great Britain and to Canada after the war, loyalists who did not want to give up their loyalty to Great Britain. Yeah, yes.
What happened to British soldiers? Did they stay here or did they go home or were they killed?
Yeah, what happened to the British soldiers? Did they stay here? Did they go home? Were they killed? I'm doing a quick remembrance of prisoners of war. I think there were some prisoner of war camps. They were not killed outright. They were eventually released. Some of you know, Great Britain also hired soldiers for hire, hired German soldiers for hire. That's one of my ancestors, actually. I have a Hessian soldier. He was, you know, captured or he escaped and married an American girl and stayed. So that happened as well. But most of them eventually went home. Yeah. Yes, Ryan.
Another question online, asking if you know anything about Josiah Bartlett, apparently a friend of his, a relative of him, who's a signer, physician, and governor of New Hampshire. I don't think this is mentioned, I'm not sure, I don't think so.
I'm sorry, I don't have information on the top of my head. I apologize for that. Yeah.
What was the question?
Oh, I'm sorry. About Josiah Bartlett. Josiah Bartlett, governor of New Hampshire and a signer of the Declaration of Independence. I've got notes on my laptop over there, but at the end of a lecture, it's hard for me to, yeah. Yes.
Benjamin Franklin
Mhm.
spent time in France. That was after the Declaration, he was significant in getting the French to send all sort of weaponry and non-weapon stuff that the armies needed
Yes.
to fight.
Yes, the comment is about Benjamin Franklin, how he went to France after he signed the Declaration and was there for many years and cultivated relationships with the French and helped to persuade the French come in on the American side, which truly gave us the firepower that we needed to finally defeat a large British force at Yorktown. Yeah, even before the French sent troops over, French money was flowing over. Thanks to Franklin's work. Yeah. There was another pair that didn't get along, Adams and Franklin. They were polar opposites and they were together in France and that was not a happy relationship. Yes.
Would it be fair to say that without the help of the French, we probably would have lost the Revolutionary War?
Yes, I think that'd be fair to say that without the help of the French, we would have lost the Revolutionary War. Yes. Yes.
Well, I'm sure you've been to the Philadelphia, the new museum, the Revolutionary War Museum. It's fairly new and very, very interesting and worth people's time.
The comment is about the new Revolutionary War Museum in Philadelphia, a relatively new museum, definitely worth people's time. And I got to say, I bet they're gearing up for next year. Even this year, you know, with the beginning of the war, of course, it began in Massachusetts and not in Pennsylvania, but certainly next year. If you're thinking about, gosh, where might we travel next year, I suggest that would be a really good place.